Good morning, everyone, and a very warm welcome to the Shared Transport Conference 2021, which we are very proudly bringing you here from Como, UK. It's been quite the year again, I think it's fair to say, hasn't it? It's been a year of turbulence in shared transport, a year of growth, a year of some positive change without doubt, and also a year of continued frustrations that more of this sector is not able to do the heavy lifting on decarbonisation, on nicer places, on cleaner air, that we know it can from all our evidence and research here at Como UK. But nonetheless, lots to be positive about amidst all the ongoing awful human cost of this pandemic. One impact of that, of course, has been many changed travel patterns, which we'll be talking about in, I think, lots of different ways over these next couple of days through this wide range of sessions. One bit of travel I was very pleased and privileged to be able to do was to come to Glasgow, the city my wife is from, for COP26 as part of the event we put on as the Sustainable Transport Alliance, a group of other sustainable transport NGOs that Como UK played a leading role in pulling together. I wanted to just quote a tiny bit of the transport declaration that came out of the COP26 conference. And it says this: "We recognise that alongside the shift to zero emission vehicles, a sustainable future for road transport will require wider system transformation, including support for active travel, public and shared transport." We're really pleased with that. That's very much on the right lines for us. And the UK government is a signatory to this declaration. And it fits very much for us with the direction of travel signalled by the Transport Decarbonisation Plan, among other recent publications from government. Wider system transformation, for me, hits the nail very well on the head. That is, I think, what we are about in shared transport, but it's also what we need to see. And I think that goes for our speakers across this conference, to whom our thanks. I think it goes for our sponsors, to whom also our thanks, and without which this wouldn't be happening, to our attendees, and certainly for us at Como UK. So we have an exciting range of sessions coming up. We are tackling decarbonisation in this one, led off by the Minister in just a second. We are looking at the built environment and its ability to cut or embed future transport emissions, the role that bike share plays in boosting mental and physical health, the tipping point that I see us being at as a country on powered micromobility. And then tomorrow we dive into city region strategies, into moving beyond the urban core out through the suburbs, transport justice, and last but very much not least, mobility hubs that can help bring all this together and attract and keep people out of private cars in particular. So I'd now like to bring the Minister, Trudy Harrison, still new in role, onto the stage. We are really thrilled that she's here to open our conference with a keynote. Minister, great to see you. The Q&A will be open through the Minister's remarks, and she's kindly agreed to take a couple of questions afterwards. So if you have a question for her, please pop it in. Minister, over to you. Thank you.
Oh, thank you very much, Richard. Thanks very much for the invitation too to open today's conference. And I'd like to start by recognising the great work that Como UK does. We certainly need more voices such as yours so that we can design a transport system that is fit for the future and free of fossil fuels, which moves us away from the 20th century thinking centred around private vehicle ownership and towards greater flexibility with personal choice and low carbon shared transport. I think actually that the future is much closer than we may think. When you look at the progress that has been made in the space of just a year, we've launched the Transport Decarbonisation Plan, our net zero strategy, and of course, as you mentioned, we've hosted COP26. And we're trialling future transport zones across the country, unleashing British innovation and transforming inner city journeys. For all its devastation, the pandemic has created an opportunity for lasting behaviour change in how we go about our travels. So I would say my message here is pretty simple. This government really does get it, and transport will inevitably align itself with the shared economy, where value will be measured by the case with which you can access services rather than what you permanently own. And I think the statistics really bear this out. According to Warwick Business School, 78% of 18 to 24-year-olds use a shared economy service, from Zipcar to Lyft Share and Airbnb. These services are high convenience and they can help people to manage the costs of travel flexibly. And if fast is becoming a lifestyle choice, so transport must keep pace, because by giving more people the easy access to a range of mobility options, will connect people to economic opportunity and reduce carbon emissions and level up the country. So if I can start with the transport decarbonisation plan, it's the umbrella for much of our future mobility work. A world first, and it's the most extensive plan of its kind, tackling the biggest source of UK CO2 emissions. It will end the sale of all new polluting road vehicles in the next 2 decades, up to and including the heaviest trucks, and also commits the UK to a net zero rail network by 2050. And to kickstarting the commercialisation of sustainable aviation fuels. The pledges allowed us to demonstrate leadership on the world stage in Glasgow in November, and ultimately helped us to secure 120 signatories to our zero emission vehicle declaration, committing them to 100% new zero emission car and van sales by 2040 at the latest. But we know that in the short and medium term, we need to give people alternatives to private vehicles, especially cars. Firstly, to ease the congestion on our roads, which ends up being a drag on our economy, and of course, to reduce the air and noise pollution, which is so damaging to our own health and the planet's too. That's why we've committed £92 million across 4 future transport zones to test new ways to transport people and goods. It's very much a collaborative effort, giving our most creative mobility businesses the opportunity to work with councils, hospitals and universities. And I would say that the results have been very impressive. We've seen mobility as a service platforms spring up, offering people the ease and convenience of booking shared or public transport options from their phone, as easy as ordering a takeaway. In the West Midlands, you can now trade in your polluting car for up to £3,000 worth of mobility credits. And that can be spent on bike rentals, on car shares, or public transport. The region is also piloting a mobility hub where you can access an entire ecosystem of shared transport in one place, including e-scooters, cargo bikes, cycle hire, and electric car club vehicles. When you realise that a quarter of all car journeys are under 2 miles, the potential of mobility hubs is really as clear as day. Yet, for those who still feel this is a passing fad that won't stand the test of time, I think you need to look at the data. E-scooters, for example, over 1 million active e-scooter users have covered almost 25 million kilometres within our future transport zones. That's the equivalent of going to the moon 25 times. Or when you look at bike shares, 30,000 trips are made daily. And with 1,000 bikes located at 100 station hubs across the future transport zones, we're helping people complete the first and last mile journeys as efficiently as possible. But, and this is quite personal to me, these benefits should not be exclusive to city dwellers. I'm a Cumbrian MP. I feel really strongly that this needs to be inclusive. And I also know that for many people in rural areas, a car is a lifetime. But we are trying to change that. That's why we're piloting demand responsive travel in 17 locations. So at the touch of a smartphone, a minibus can pick someone up nearer the home and at more convenient times. Yet despite all of these positive steps in the right direction towards a low carbon, more convenient and increasingly shared mobility future, changing the way that people consider car ownership and car dependency will take time. There are simple steps to reduce the impact of cars on congestion and pollution, such as increasing car clubs or lift sharing. But unfortunately, 62% of car trips are taken by lone drivers. That's a staggering statistic, and it's pretty much stayed constant for nearly 20 years, which is why government have committed to increase the average road vehicle occupancy by 2030. And if that increase is only marginal, we would save thousands of tons of carbon, and we know that there's a demand. Platforms such as LiftShare have allowed 745,000 members to share their commute over the past decade. And our Commute Zero programme will continue to work with employers to promote low carbon commuting. Before I conclude, I'd really like to issue a challenge to the local transport authorities and regional bodies represented here today. Government absolutely needs your help to deliver this transition. I've worked in local government. I know that real change is best delivered on the ground at the local level by the people that really understand their area. That's why we're providing £5.7 billion in sustainable transport settlements to help combined authorities deliver more mass transit options. And it's why in the budget we announced £1.2 billion of dedicated funding for bus transformation deals, which is part of an over £3 billion worth of new spend on buses over this Parliament. We've recently committed £710 million in new funding to support ambitious cycling and walking programmes, from more cycle lanes and wider pavements to walk to school programmes. And I think really importantly, we're providing the guidance to match the funding. Having that support is really, really critical. We'll soon be publishing a local authority decarbonisation toolkit to help you deliver more sustainable transport options. The first edition will include best practice and case studies on car clubs, zero emission buses, car and lift sharing, and demand responsive transport. I think it's a particularly long-held view that government should provide that necessary support, but allow the local experts to get on with the job of rolling it out. So the challenge is to move further and faster to make shared mobility less of a novelty and increasing the norm, to make it as easy, as convenient, and as accessible as possible. I am going to end by quoting a columnist for an American magazine who in 1995 wrote a piece about the future of the internet. He clearly wasn't a believer. He said, "The truth is no online database will replace your daily newspaper. No CD-ROM can take the place of a competent teacher, and no computer network will change the way that government works." To make matters worse, he went on to pour cold water on the idea that anyone would buy books or newspapers over the internet. And the reason I mention this is because many things seem far-fetched until they aren't. And I believe the same is true for shared mobility. We are reaching a tipping point where shared mobility in the form of car clubs, scooters and bike shares will soon be a realistic option for many of us to get around, where mobility hubs become a familiar part of our street architecture, and where all these options will be available to book and pay for at the touch of a smartphone. I think the benefits are really significant, from clean air to healthier populations to greater connectivity for more people, no matter where they live. And so it's about getting on with the work. And I thank you very much once again for inviting me to speak with you all today and for all the work that you're doing.
Minister, thank you. That was fantastic. I'm really heartened by that. And I think also it's good to reflect that government now has something of substance to say about every shared transport mode that is part of our world. And that wasn't always the case by any means. So it's keep the rapid progress going, please. A couple of questions are coming through. So we'll ask you a couple. I know your time is short, so it won't take too long. One I wanted to kick off with is, are you prepared to be bold if needed? It's my observation that sometimes there is a need for striking out in a bold direction. I think government's done some of that in relation to transport in these last couple of years. But does that feel scary and off-putting to you, or does that feel something you're ready to do if needed?
I think it would be absolutely expected of me. I think it was bold that the Prime Minister set out a 10-point plan and followed it up with policies that would support all of those 10 points. And they were wide-ranging, but very much focused on transport. I think when the Secretary of State launched, I believe, a world first, our green print, the Transport Decarbonisation Plan, that again was pretty bold. And I think courageous to phase out the sale of new petrol and diesel cars from 2030 against some advice with some trepidation about whether manufacturers would be able to keep up and whether consumers would actually want to purchase the vehicles. But I think that boldness, that courage has paid off. And when the Prime Minister gave me the call and asked me to do the job, it was absolutely on the understanding that we would be bold and courageous with our decisions, but also that we would apply common sense, make sure it's based on evidence-based proof, and most importantly, that decisions are made collaboratively. So it's not a politician going off on a whim, but it's thanks to consultation with academia, with industry, with service users, and also looking internationally at what other countries are doing and working with organisations like Mobility to make sure that we do this in a way that's inclusive and accessible for all.
Yeah, thank you. I think that's really important also. A couple of detailed questions and then we will let you go, if I may. One is on bike share. How can the government help procurement for bike share, which can take an inordinately long time? It's not a Coma UK question, but it is one that I definitely recognise that certainly can be true.
Well, we've committed £2 billion towards better cycling generally, including infrastructure. I do not actually know what the challenge is with the procurement of bikes for bike share. It's not something that I've been asked about before. I think if that person who's put the question wants to get in touch, are we saying that there's a lack of supply? Is there a lack of legal entity? Is there a lack of storage for the bikes? Is there a lack of how we could actually hire them out and insurance? I'm
very happy
to give. Go on.
You and I had a catch up just last week, in fact, and we were talking about bike share then. So I'm very happy to put the questioner and us and you in touch. I would intuit from it that it's actually about the procurement process, not about the kit. That certainly, to my observation, is where the slowness often comes in.
Okay, well, I'm not aware, and I've probably said that my husband's an avid cyclist. So my personal experience is buying one particularly well-researched bike for whichever purpose or terrain or activity is being considered in the household. But clearly there's work to do on the procurement of many bikes for shared purpose. So leave that one with me. It's also an area that my colleague Chris Heaton-Harris, as the Minister for Cycling, would probably have more of an understanding on. So I will hop over to his office and ask the question.
Excellent. Thank you. And last one, are you concerned by the number of private e-scooters which will be gifted this Christmas, which the question says which aren't road legal, but of course, technically it's the case they're illegal to ride on public highway, they're legal to buy. So there's the conundrum, as you know well.
Yeah, I am, because instinctively I want to support a growing market. And my understanding is that the sale of e-scooters is very much increasing. But these vehicles are not always up to the standard that we would require, and we're working with BEIS to try and do something about that. They also often go much faster than what is the limit in the trial areas at the moment, which is around about 15.5 miles per hour. That said, I am delighted that there's interest, and the conundrum I think I have is enabling e-scooters to become a mode of choice in villages, towns and cities as well, but to be ridden safely and responsibly so as not to cause harm to the driver or other people also using the network, and also really, really importantly, not to damage the reputation that e-scooters have, because I very much want us to build legislation that enables e-scooters to be used in the UK as they are in other countries around the world. I want it to be a positive, safe, predominantly safe experience for all. And sometimes I think the illegal use of scooters damages the potential to do that. So on the one hand, I'm absolutely delighted that people are willing to spend their own money on this new form of transport in the UK. But on the other hand, it's a balance about safety.
Yeah, thank you. That very much fits with where we are. We work a lot with the e-scooter trials and operators, and there's a huge amount of positivity around that, but it's a completely unregulated market on the private sales side, as we know.
And I am writing to manufacturers and the sales outlets to make them aware of the legalities of riding scooters. I also think many people probably provide them as gifts without reason, without understanding the current legality. So it's a difficult one, but I'm hopeful.
Thank you. Minister, thank you so much for your time. Really appreciate it. And we look forward to lots of dialogue and exchange over the coming year and beyond.
Thank you very much again.
All right. Thank you very much. All right, everyone. Thank you for the great questions. Do keep the debate going throughout the sessions. I'd now like to welcome up our panel for this next session on decarbonisation. So if they will join me on the stage, please. And we are going to have some questions between them, an element of them interviewing each other, so you won't have to listen to me all the time. And then very keen to take questions also. We'll flag up when we're getting near those times. So can I introduce our panelists first off? Claire Linton from the Urban Transport Group, David Carnero from Padam Mobility, Lars Ove Kvalbin from the city of Bergen in Norway, one of our European collaborator organisations, and great to have you with us, Lars, and Professor Greg Marsden from the University of Leeds, whose work has been so instrumental in shared transport for the last number of years. And you heard the Minister refer to the vehicle occupancy target, I draw at least a dotted line between Greg and Gillian Annable's and others' great work on the Commission for Reduction of Travel Demand and those sorts of targets. So let us get into the questions and debate in a second. But first off, I want to run a poll. We're going to have a number of these through the sessions. And the question on this one is, what is the one main thing that should be done to deliver on carbonisation? So we'll run this pretty quickly. And then once it's been running for, don't know what we're going to give it, 30 seconds or so, then we will get the results up. And it's a one-word answer, please, to keep it brief. Good. I'm glad to see pricing coming. This will, I think, generate a word cloud, so we'll see about the predominance of different answers. Great, thank you. Some more answers coming in. You can find it in the Q&A/polls tab on your screen view. And now we're into the game of which one's going to win. These are some great answers. All right, thank you. Really interesting. The thread I take from that is price. Pricing is the largest single one there. Oh, just being joined by Active Travel. But there's quite a few others which have a price element to them as well. ULEZ, affordability, etc. All right, lovely. Thank you. Let us move to the panel debate, and we're going to kick off with the same question to each panelist, which is a similar one, and deliberately, it's what is the key challenge for our sector, our shared transport sector? Claire, I'm going to come to you first, if I may.
Yeah, thanks very much, Richard, and really interesting to see the different themes popping up in that poll there. I think for me, one of the biggest challenges, well, the biggest challenge is dealing with single occupancy car use. You know, cars are 50%, 57% of our transport emissions in the UK, and occupancy is still very low, and it's proved a really tricky nut to crack to kind of, you know, build occupancy and kind of make our use of cars more efficient. And also kind of how we use those cars. Most cars are sitting on the drive, especially now a lot of people are working from home all the time. So kind of those assets, how we use those assets as well. But something that's really stuck in my head from last year's Como conference is something that Sandra Phillips said about having a Swiss Army knife of mobility options and picking the right tool for the right job. And I think applying that to mobility and making sure we've got the right choices for the right journeys could really help us kind of decarbonise. And I think shared transport has a really, really key role to play in that.
Thank you. Yeah, I remember that session too. That's fantastic. Thank you very much. Lars, can I come to you next? What's your answer?
Thank you, Richard. Thanks for inviting me, and we really enjoy working together with Como UK in our common Interreg project, Share North, on shared mobility. What I think is that from our context here in Norway, the electrification part of this decarbonisation of transport is the really easy part. Most people outside Norway think this has to do with the generous incentives for electrification in Norway, but it has more to do actually with building up kind of acceptance for over years for taxing the fossil fuel cars heavily, so that when you remove some of the taxes for the electric cars, you get a very, very strong, like was mentioned here, pricing incentive towards decarbonisation. And in our city, we have now like 85% of new car sale or more is battery electric, and 30% of the whole private car fleet is electric, and all the buses are battery electric now. So that's going really well. But the really key challenge is to change people's habits. You know, it's a big cultural shift away from the private car, the convenience of that, into the share modes and public transport. So that's why we'll try to make a stick and carrot approach to this in our city, both building mobility hubs on the carrot side, supporting both the electrification and the shared modes like car clubs, bike sharing, e-scooters, and various kinds of bike parking facilities, making these options more visible, more accessible for the inhabitants of our city.
Super, thank you. That 30% figure is really striking. The equivalent here in the UK is 10% as a national average, probably going up slightly beyond that now, but only rising to about 12% in London. So we're quite some way off that. Thank you. David, could I come to you next with the same question?
Yeah, sure. So I think it's making public transport more accessible. And so bringing that to the theme today, it's integrating or having shared mobility as part of integrated transport. And what I saw during the themes that came up earlier, one was commute. So in a large city in France, where we have a DRT service that does 20,000 trips per month, 60% of those are for the commute. And I think that's where DRT can really play a role in an integrated transport policy, and do things like Lars said, such as change behaviour, and things like that. So that's what I think is a big topic.
Brilliant, thank you. We're really positive about DDRT at Como UK. I always bring in my background at Which, the consumer organisation here, and I think it's Super important the Minister Reference Service uses, quite rightly, I think. It's super important we have a focus on what works for people as well as what decarbonises, and I think DDRT can deliver on that at scale. Greg, could I come to you?
Yeah, thanks, Richard. And it was great to have such a positive opening narrative by the minister. I felt particularly using a lot of the data for the sector, so I really feel like the message is getting across at the top levels of government. I mean, we're clearly we're already in a period where there's a real growth in some exciting new mobility services, which when integrated are already offering good alternatives to the car for a lot more people. So this is a great time to be in the sector. I think my concern is that the tailwinds of technology in the shared mobility sector are facing the headwinds of lower cost motoring as we electrify, and we know that once people make that decision to own a car, the rational decision is to make use of it for many more journeys. So a vibrant shared mobility sector is really critical. It's going to be even more important as we move into the spring, where we have to recognise that there's going to be a bit of a reckoning with kind of post-COVID public transport levels and the amount of funding that's available to continue to support those services. So I think my key challenge is how can we scale up quickly and make use of the innovations in light electric mobility to provide alternative low-cost, less car-based lifestyles before the sector's growth is limited by the kind of wave of electrification in the private vehicle market, because I think that will make the job of making shared transport that much more difficult. So that's my challenge ahead.
Yeah, thank you. Great stuff. The Committee on Climate Change we have here in the UK, the independent body that, if you like, marks government's homework, but fundamentally marks where we are on the graphs of decarbonisation. I always find it very sobering when you look at their forward projections and look at what they build in on induced mileage based on EVs being much cheaper to run, not acquire, but run per mile, and than ICE vehicles. And of course, that's just pointing in entirely the wrong direction, isn't it? So I agree. There's a big challenge there.
Yeah, and actually, I think they are a better quality product than the internal combustion engine vehicle as well. So I think we need to kind of factor that in to our thinking. I mean, I'm really interested by what the other panelists have been saying. I was going to ask Claire a question, if that's all right, Richard.
Okay,
so we talk a lot about the new mobility innovations, and we sometimes we talk about things as new and old, but actually it's probably the mix. So what is the role of public transport in this multimodal transport system of the future?
Yeah, well, I think public transport's critical and key to kind of achieving our decarbonisation targets. And I think kind of how we integrate shared transport within the kind of a multimodal landscape will be really important. So kind of trying to build on convenience for people. So I think we've seen a lot of sort of bike sharing e-scooters in city centres where there's the kind of like people doing short journeys, affluent sort of younger population. But how do we kind of get it out into kind of maybe more suburban areas? And I think the suburbs session tomorrow will pick up on some of this and kind of thinking about building mobility hubs that are close to where people live so that we can kind of integrate this shared transport and public transport landscape to kind of help build both and help people to make, live less car dependent lifestyles. And then maybe people will be more facilitated to make the decision not to own a car and maybe have a car for the journeys that they need to do through car sharing or car clubs. But I think, as you said, the challenge in public transport is huge to try and recover the patronage that we've lost through the pandemic, and what we're going to see kind of in spring with the funding. It is a big hill to climb, but I think it's such an important part of the mix, and especially for people who don't own a car, and there are large parts of our population who don't own a car and are completely reliant on public transport. So we need to kind of keep supporting that part of the system. I think also how we make the connections kind of between transport and energy in the built environment. I think mobility hubs are a really, really interesting opportunity to do that and kind of build that into kind of outside the urban core, so we can kind of get those options out to people close to where they live, and kind of create that shared multimodal landscape for more people, and potentially in rural areas as well. But I'd be really interested to hear from Lars on kind of what's happened in the city of Bergen around this, and kind of how you've approached mobility hubs and the policy objectives you've put in place to kind of deliver the really good progress that you've seen in Bergen.
Yeah, of course, I'd like to tell more about that. Like I mentioned, the mobility hubs, we have around 7 in operation now, 9 more being built as we speak. The figure so far has been really, really good. We can actually, when we make these options more available, more visible, we can actually go out in the streets and see that in that area, the numbers of parked cars is declining. And we can measure it also from our data. The cars per household rate is going down in those areas. It's working. And now we're seeing more car clubs coming into the city. We have more than 400 shared cars, maybe about 5,000-6,000 users in the city with less than 300,000 inhabitants, plus peer-to-peer car sharing. And then now all around up to 8,000 e-scooters have flooded into the city as well. So a lot of things are happening. But as you were mentioning earlier, it takes a lot, when the private electric car is so attractive. It takes a lot to have policies to keep that from not taking off too much and being and increasing traffic and those kind of things. So for us, it's been really important to have this kind of strong policies that supports the shift away from private car ownership. And the 2 or 3 main policies that have been really important for us. And the first one is a toll ring around the city, originally built for creating funds for making better roads, but now only the funds are only used for investing in public transport and bike and walking infrastructure. And they've added the congestion charge into it, and also the pricing differentiated according to your vehicle's emissions, so that it's about £5 to go into the city center with a diesel car at rush hour, whether much cheaper with an electric car. So this is push this in the right way, and also so the traffic into the city center has declined more than 10% the last 5 years, and we also have a strong parking policy. It's expensive and a bit awkward to park your car in the streets, and then we're trying to make the shared options more attractive compared to the private car. It costs you £50 a month to park in the street. And then we're also working with car-free areas, just literally taking away the options of parking your cars in the streets. But we need those kind of strong policies to stagger this the attractiveness of the private electric car, really. What we just scratched the surface, I think, when it comes to really integrating this kind of new attractive transport modes. And I would like to hear from my fellow panelist here, David, some more examples on how you're integrating these modes in a way that can compete with the private car.
Yeah, just I think, knowing Greg, you'll have something. I'm sure he'll have something to say actually in terms of what you just covered there, Lars. So I'll let him come in and then I'll answer afterwards.
Yeah, thanks, David. Yeah, Lars, really interested to hear about the mobility hubs. Feels to me like we just don't invest enough money in our suburban areas. But I'm wondering, like, how where in the city you're putting these, how big the mobility hubs have to be, because it seems to me that we haven't even got the kind of minimum basics right. There's lots of public transport interchange points where there's no bike parking anywhere nearby, or safe places for leaving scooters. Does it have to be the full integrated picture, or have you got kind of different levels of provision?
Well, definitely the latter one. This concept can be really scaled to fit sort of any context, and we started off with the relatively small ones in the neighborhood level, in the urban neighborhood, where we have street parking, and that's the area maybe it's easiest to make it work, because these strong policies are more effective there. So it could be just a few, reserved parking bays with charging or without charging for car clubs, some other features like bike parking, and you get a significant impact. And then you can locate them near public transport stops and try to integrate that way. You can add bike sharing stations or e-scooters and all those kinds of things according to the local needs. So we're now building different concepts according to the area of the city that we're investing in. We're just barely starting to look at the suburban areas outside the city, and then the concept will be different there.
Great, thanks.
Super, thank you. Lars, can I ask you a question that's come from the audience? And please do pop questions in the Q&A section there, and we'll feed them in as we go along through this panel discussion. And then David, I very much want to come to you. So the question is, 85% of buses in Bergen are battery electric, as you said, Lars. What's the difference between how Bergen does it and UK local authorities? What can we learn from Norway? So appreciating you're not working for a UK local authority, but what leaves do you think we can take out of your book here?
Well, I'm not an expert in the UK context, but I would just encourage you to create political support for strong taxation on those on the fossil fuel sides and on the private car sides. That's the main takeaway, and also to support initiatives for like investing in the mobility hubs and those things that make the alternative attractive. It's really quite simple, but anyway, very hard. And it's not 85% of the buses. It's well, just 85% of new car sales is battery electric, and we are 100% of the buses are electric.
Yes, right. Yeah. Yeah, I totally echo that. But it's really quite simple, but that doesn't make it easy. Absolutely. David, we were going to come to you, so could we come to you, please? I think I'd particularly like to hear about some where DDRT, your field's been working well, but anything you want to cover?
Yeah, so I think one of the big topics as it relates to the UK is actually scale of the network. So in our case, it's scale of the DRT service. So just some examples elsewhere, and it's actually not in the sense to say not to knock what's going on in the UK. Because actually what we did elsewhere started small, but it had a vision to get to scale. And I think that's the really important thing. So the three examples, and it's always about being concrete. Paris is an example. So inside the equivalent of the M25 around London, we fill all the transport black spots actually. So if you think around London, you have parts of Surrey, for example, where there's very little public transport. So all inside the M25, we have coming up to 40 DRT services. They are moving 60,000 people per month. And again, it's very focused on integrated transport. So that's in terms of the connections and the service design, actually. But also in terms of the ticketing, which is very important. So on one ticket, you can take the DRT bus and the metro, for example. Orleans and Strasbourg are other places. So these are smaller cities. where we're looking at linking the rural community and the suburban community with the city centre. So again, these are done at scale. So scale, what does scale mean? You're looking at 20 vehicles in Strasbourg and 30 vehicles in Orléans. Actually, coming back to decarbonisation, a lot of those are EVs. And they're again integrated with the public transport network. So Strasbourg, 43% of DRT journeys connect with the tram, for example. And that's a key part of the scale equation, is the connection with public transport. So as I said, it's not to say that these are bigger and better, because actually they started small, like we're doing in the UK with the rural mobility funds, like some of the future transport zones have. But it's having that vision which is key in terms of where it can go and what it can bring.
Thank you. Claire, you wanted to come in, I think, here.
Yeah, and it's really interesting what David's saying there about DRT, and I'll come back to DRT in a minute, but I just wanted to say a little bit about kind of bus electrification and shared transport. So I think it'll be really interesting to kind of see what's happening in the West Midlands in the coming years. So I know the Minister mentioned the kind of mobility credits trial in Coventry, and Coventry is also going to be the first all-electric bus city. So all the buses in Coventry are going to be electrified in the coming years. So I think as a kind of micro experiment, well, maybe not micro, it's a fairly big city, and I actually grew up in Coventry. So I'm kind of really excited to see kind of how the shared mobility credits trial goes and how the kind of electrification of the bus fleet goes along with that. And we're just seeing kind of bike share rolled out in the Midlands as well. And I took my dad, I was there in the summer, and I took my dad out on the bike share, and he was really, really skeptical. He was like, oh, it's going to be rubbish. And then he loved it, and it's really close to his house. So I hope that he'll kind of like use that. It's integrated with the park and ride site that's not far from them. So I think it'll be really interesting to see how it develops in Coventry and the West Midlands more widely in the coming years, and kind of that integrated piece on kind of electrification and shared mobility. On demand responsive transport, I'm really interested in kind of the opportunities on door-to-door transport and kind of the role of shared and kind of offering that option. So I recently moved house, and I'm kind of like just getting used to how I'm journey planning from here and using public transport and cycling and walking. But one of the things I found quite difficult as moving into winter is the kind of like traveling in the dark and feeling safe. And I think kind of shared transport has real opportunity to kind of plug in those gaps, like David was saying, and hit those transport black spots, but also kind of, I mean, I live 10-15 minutes from the bus, but I'm not 100% confident working back late at night. So even in areas where you've got good public transport, how do you kind of offer those kind of door-to-door options? So I'd be interested in kind of what the panel across the piece have got to say, but in particular kind of like David as a DDRT operator.
Yeah, sure. So it's very interesting you say that. So the way we're doing it at the moment, I would say, is on the door-to-door piece, we're using it for people primarily who have reduced mobility, actually. So what we do, it falls into what we call the aggregated DRT service. And what that means is you have the general public DRT, but then you can have other specialist services that run on top of that. So hence the aggregation. So things like Dial-A-Ride in the UK, things like special education needs transport. And as we see things today, those are the types of services that primarily use door-to-door. The reason why is a question of cost. So you can reduce cost by running a virtual stop service versus a door-to-door service. So I think the key thing actually would be a commitment, I would say, from government, be that nationally or locally, to, in the case of rural transport, to subsidize it to the level that's required. And then things like door-to-door really could be deployed at scale. We do, for example, so it's kind of a halfway measure, I will admit, but we do advise authorities on ensuring that the stops are under 300 meters from the housing area, if you like, and where people get onto the bus. So we make it very clear. So instead of having that 10 to 15 minute walk that you mentioned, which is not ideal, especially when it's dark, and especially if you're in a rural environment, you can bring that down to 4 or 5, but it always comes back to cost, unfortunately. So that's where it is today.
I think it's a really good question about personal safety, Claire. I mean, I have heard in various discussions on sort of taxi ride hailing that there are also concerns about being picked up door to door and sort of people knowing addresses and so on. So there's probably a balance somewhere in terms of like having a secure network of stops. So if what David's suggesting, about virtual stops is perhaps a better way of working, then maybe it's about that investment again outside of the city centres in providing higher quality routes. I also think I may be interested, I don't know whether there's any experience of this, Lars, but if mobility hubs are going to become a more integrated environment with retail, for example, then surveillance is surveillance and lighting is a really critical part of the safety piece. If there are people around, there are places to go, and the whole thing is just better quality. I imagine that will reduce for some people some of the anxieties of traveling at night in the winter. So these wider benefits are things I think that we ought to be tapping into the case for investment in better infrastructure for shared mobility across a much wider space.
Yeah, I can just comment shortly on that. The issue of safe environment, better lighting is really come up very quickly around the mobility hubs. We were not that much aware of that in the first ones we built. But now we need to be much more aware of that, take that into account in the planning. We're also designing them with more like with urban furniture, green space, meeting places for people, getting eyes on the streets, good lighting, and those kind of things. So as we think all of that is sort of contributing to creating a safer space.
Thank you. I would like to jump in on a rural thread here, just because we've had a couple of questions through on this, I think very understandably. One is, one's got a lot of knots in it. So rural public transport is not frequent, not connected into main routes, not matched to commuting, and underused, supported by local subsidy, but that's under threat. How do we get radical change and funding? And then related to that, we have a similar question really in the also on shared mobility options, very much focused on urban areas. How can government help expand shared mobility into rural areas, Cumbria, Devon, etc.? So can I just throw that out there, and anyone wants to come in, please do.
So this is a matter very close to our heart. So rural transport, it's where we come from, actually. So rural and suburban. I think coming back to what was said, so I think there are two things. One, I think there does have to be a recognition that rural transport needs to be subsidized. I think when I'm asked about rural DRT services in particular, and when will they break even, or when will they stand on their two legs, I respond, give me an example of rural transport that does that, irrespective of the type of transport. So I think there has to be a recognition of that and an investment in that. And then it's really about, like the points that were made, it's about integrated transport. It's about bringing people to the structural transport network to allow them to continue on their onward journey. We can include within that now mobility hubs as well, because the complete mix of public transport being the backbone, but then micro-mobility, stroke DDRT when it's right, providing the first and last mile, I think is really where I'd like to see it going, and a fully integrated approach on that. But I think the key thing is funding. I mean, that has to be acknowledged.
Thank you. We've got funding. Greg, what do you reckon?
Yeah, well, I fully commend everything that David just said as a start point. I mean, there aren't any urban public transport services that don't require subsidy either. So let's be open about that. But I think with the rural environment, it's important to start thinking about different mixes of shared mobility. So for me, I think community-based initiatives, whether they're community car clubs or whether it's peer-to-peer sharing of access to vehicles, we have to accept that we're not going to be able to provide the same level of coverage. So what is it that we are going to be able to provide that's going to be give people access and affordable access? So I think the peer-to-peer market is one. I think there are opportunities. Even in rural areas, there are concentrations of employment. And so working with the employers to say, right, okay, where are your employees coming from? What are the services that we could potentially aggregate to ensure that you've got good access to a labour market that's reliable? And I think the other thing is the potential for e-bikes. Now, I know a lot of rural areas have a lot of roads that are really, you would feel unsafe cycling on, given the speed and the design and layout of the roads. But where there's a need, where there's poor accessibility, then investment in off-road cycle tracks that provide some of that accessibility. E-bikes will actually deliver a much better kind of per mile outcome in rural areas than they will in urban areas, where you've got all the stop-start of the traffic lights and so on. So I think we've got to look and imagine a different type of mix in rural areas.
Really interesting, thank you. We certainly find in the Como research, shared e-bike is even more effective at getting people out of car than shared bike is, which I think goes to the same set of dynamics you're just putting your finger on there, Greg. Claire, you wanted to come in.
Yeah, I actually wanted to come in on the point about e-bikes there. So Greg, I completely support kind of what was said there, and we've recently done some work on e-bikes, and the potential is huge, especially in rural areas, and they just really kind of open up the little bit more distance, little bit more comfort. And for anyone who hasn't ridden an e-bike, they're so much fun. They're really, really great. And it kind of, I always liken it to the difference between going for a run. Like if you're cycling, if you're cycling fast, obviously not if you're cycling slower, but if you're cycling fast, you might feel like you've been for a run. If you're cycling on an e-bike, you feel like you've been for a brisk walk, like you've got the exercise, but you haven't kind of got the hot and sweaty side of it. So I really feel like it just offers that little bit more extension that maybe like conventional cycling doesn't. And yeah, through kind of a shared system, it's such a great opportunity to kind of support those areas that are a little bit further out. But like Greg says, we do need the kind of right kind of infrastructure for people to feel safe and comfortable doing that.
Yeah, thank you. There's an e-cycle support program coming out from government actually at the moment, which doesn't really head-on feature bike share, which I think is a mistake. But we're doing our best to see if we can get something for e-bike share in that, and certainly in future dialogue. You heard the minister refer to Chris Heaton-Harris, her fellow minister in the department. It's one of those bits of join up hasn't quite happened here yet. Lars, do you want to come in on this thread we're talking about just now?
Well, I really strongly believe in e-bikes as well. When I turned 50, I got one, and my life has changed. I can go now, even in winter conditions here in Bergen, last week's with studded tires, always get there on time. So yeah, I suppose support that. And we are also planning to look into testing the type of shared e-bikes. Pilots and trials, especially in the suburban areas further away from the city center. We don't have that now. We have regular bikes, shared bikes, but we really believe that that's a big game changer. And we're seeing also the big car manufacturers are moving into that market as well, and that's a sign of something significant, I think.
Just one follow-up, Richard. I was doing some analysis the other day for a social housing company, wondering what their role is in future of mobility. And when you look at household expenditure on transport in the UK, the bottom half of the distribution spend less than £60 a week on transport in the household. And I think that's quite sobering. I think the market for shared mobility has been operating more in the range of the household spending 150 pounds a week. And if you're looking to solve issues in rural areas, households that have cars are probably not going to be at that end of the distribution so much. So I think there's a real problem about, as David said, how are you actually going to provide the level of service to serve the people who perhaps need it most, but who don't have the resources to kind of fund the financially, more attractive services for operators. It has to be a question of how we're going to pay for it, I think.
And I just chime in, that really resonates actually, because not to divert to the topic of mass, but just for a brief interlude. When I'm asked what's the role of DDRT in mass, it actually is exactly what you've just said. So my answer to that is micromobility, in terms of the current pricing of micromobility, is accessible to a certain level of is accessible when you have a certain level of income, and actually that's when DDRT comes in, because if it's done in a way, in an integrated transport approach where it correlates to the public transport pricing, it opens up the available options to impact things like economic policy, social policy, getting people back to work, et cetera, or getting people to have access to work and also education. So that really resonates in what you've just said.
Thank you. Anyone else want to come in on that aspect? Otherwise, I've got a couple of audience questions to feed in. One is to you, David, in fact. How many passengers do your DRT services need to be lower CO2 and lower cost per passenger than an average car?
So I haven't done that specific analysis. So versus a car, I won't be able to answer, although I am going to take that away. So what we work to, so in terms of the indicators we work to, and I'll come back to that. So actually, if you put me in touch with the person afterwards, I'll see what we have in terms of data on that. The analysis we have, so to make a DDRT service cost effective, the key metric is somewhere between 7.5 and 8 passengers per vehicle per hour. So in terms of that break-even point. So that's the key metric we look at when working with authorities. And just coming back to a point, so in talking about rural transport needs to be subsidized, that needs to be accepted. The way we look at it is it's not to say open the checkbook and then here we go. It's actually, the focus really is working with the authority or the operator on reducing that cost per trip. So it's actually what we're trying to bring to the table is, how do you reduce that amount of subsidy that's required? So that's the key metric I can bring out here, but I'll take that away and come back to the person with some information later on.
Super, thank you. Yeah, I very much agree with that. I think we get, well, in several ways, very muddled around the word subsidy. I think here, partly that there's an obsession, as we probably all know, in the UK, certainly with capital expenditure from subsidy rather than revenue. And that's, I can see Claire smiling. That's such a hardy perennial, isn't it? But I think it's going to become more and more important if we're looking through this decade to 2030 and these really significant behavior shifts that we're going to need to hit as a country. We're going to have to just crack that. But then there's also sort of, it needs subsidy. Well, that's bad news point. But to your point, David, it obviously matters hugely how much subsidy it needs. And then, there really is obviously a set of virtuous circles to hit, which is reducing, often not eliminating, but reducing the subsidy down, which of course is also part of increasing the utilization. So you're having a much wider set of co-benefit impacts. And I think we are seeing some of that in shared transport, but in the UK, but it's early days in some fields of it, and it certainly needs quite a bit of help and shoving uphill, I think. Claire, I've got a question for you, and then a general question as well I'll come to. But first to Claire, do you see the authorities you're working with looking more seriously at expanding car clubs, or are there political barriers to the non-ownership model?
Yeah, I think it's a really interesting question. I'll just offer a little reflection on the subsidy point, because I think that's
Sure.
really interesting. Then I'll come to that question about car clubs. So one of the things we often forget is that we basically subsidize motoring. Like, we don't internalize all the costs of the private car in terms of the impacts on society, air pollution, road safety. We have huge costs, and that's only going to grow as we see an increasing electrification and reduction in kind of revenue, as our motoring taxes work at the moment. So we bulk at the idea of subsidising our kind of public transport and shared mobility, but we're already subsidising motoring by not internalising those costs. So I think it's important to remember that. On authorities on car clubs, and it kind of relates to the point Richard made about capital and revenue funding. I think authorities are keen to look at car clubs, but a lot of how they are acquiring funding is through competition funding for specific pots of money. So where an authority might have won a competition to do a future mobility zone, they might be including car clubs as part of that. But if there isn't a specific pot of money for that, then potentially they don't have the capacity and resource to look at it. So yeah, it kind of always comes back to these poor under-resourced local authorities, but it's a drag on kind of taking the strategic approach to shared mobility and decarbonisation as a whole. So yeah, we kind of need to better resource our authorities to be able to really take full advantage of the kind of range of options that are available for decarbonising and accelerating shared mobility.
I think that there may be some changes coming down the line. I mean, obviously, for the big authorities, Claire, the CRSDS funding, at least, it's not the big new money that it might have been announced as, perhaps, but at least it's freedom to spend it more on what you want. And I think that might also come with the revision to the local transport plan process, which will be more aligned with what are you going to do to deliver your carbon targets. I guess there's still the revenue capital problem will still persist within that. But I'd be interested to hear from Lars about whether that issue about should we take on a bigger role in shared car ownership. It features as an issue with the politicians in Bergen, and how have they, what view have they come to on this?
Yeah, that's a good question. And the really great thing about car clubs and car sharing is that it's really actually works by itself. It doesn't actually need that much support. That's our experience. It's been there for 20 years and it's been growing. Even without any government support. But when we do some support, like providing reserved spaces and make it visible, accessible, it grows even more and works even better. If there's an issue that this needs more support, one really low-hanging fruit that all sort of cities could do to expand this, that doesn't cost them anything. Actually, that is to integrate the use of car sharing car clubs into their own management, their own fleet. And that actually saves the money instead of buying or leasing cars that are being used in the municipal services, so that you could then you could earn money on that, because you can rent out parking spaces to the car clubs, and the municipality uses the cars at daytime. The population in the area uses it at nighttime and weekends. So it's a perfect match and a really good tool to spread this out into new areas as well. If the cities start using this in their own, in running the city, in providing the services to the inhabitants, like health services and all that kind of thing. That's really a low-hanging fruit that many cities can do, I think.
Lars, I think that's a great point, something we're trying to work on at Como. The lovely Como website has an employer action kit, and in that there's some case studies of exactly that, happening, and I think the more we can get the, as we call it here, the pool fleet, the fleet of vehicles actually owned by an entity, private company, NHS, local authority, the list goes on, and then the grey fleet, so-called, people's own vehicles where they get paid per mile to travel on company or institution business, and look at all of that and try to get efficiencies out of that as a way of helping get people out of car ownership, which saves them money, but then of course also leads to fewer cars and decarbonisation. It's another set of virtuous circles, isn't it? Of course, I just wanted to, Claire, I'll come to you in a sec, because I know you want to come in on this. On the subsidy point, the other point strikes me here is, of course, private car users, if you like, subsidise a huge amount through the sheer amounts of money that they fork out for the experience that they have. And I think there's a huge thing here to our conversation earlier with Greg about the running costs of EVs. There's a huge thing here about surfacing true costs, but also then moving the goalposts on those costs. Lars, your toll ring and so on, and congestion charging and making parking awkward and all that, all the stick side of it. Claire, you wanted to come in.
Yeah, I was just thinking about car share there, and I just had a question for Lars, and actually maybe Richard, you have some reflections kind of from a Como perspective, and your kind of findings in the survey of car club users and operators. But I was just thinking about, you often see kind of shared mobility options in kind of dense urban cores where you've got kind of affluent urban millennial populations, and I guess that's kind of right car club territory, because you've got people who don't necessarily own cars but want them for specific journeys, and then you've got kind of more suburban areas where you've got people living very car dependent lifestyles. It's kind of a question of like, where's good car club territory? Like, do you want to target the places where you've got low car ownership and you kind of will get maybe higher car club usage? Or do you want to target areas where you've got people living very car dependent lifestyles and try and shift those behaviours? And I guess it's, I don't know if you've got any reflections from Bergen or any experience kind of in the UK as well, Richard.
Lars, you go first.
Okay, that's a really good question and a difficult one. Of course, it's easy to support car clubs in those areas where it's natural, because you have good access to public transport. You don't need that. When you don't need a car every day, or at least you imagine that you don't need a car every day, it's easy. It's much harder in the suburbs, where at least in Bergen, many of them are built, really with car-based planning, with car infrastructure. But we really want to make it happen there now, and then it might need some more effort from our side, like using the municipal fleet and those kind of things to get them there. Maybe provide parking base for free for a limited time for the operators, so that they can reach out to the market. It takes some time to change people's habits, especially in those areas, and also it needs to be even more better integrated with public transport. That's really important. It's more also first last mile transport issues out there. You need to use the modes like bike sharing and e-scooters, or maybe free floating car sharing, if you do have that, to link up to the public transport network. That's much more important when you go out there, and that might need some more effort, I think.
Yeah, thank you. Claire, as you asked me, I think from the UK side, it's we know there are ground conditions that suit car sharing, public transport, quality, density, availability, and so on. Clearly, restraint of private car also helps the nature of people's lives, what journeys they need and want to make. And I think for some people, the pandemic here has, it has been part of why we've seen strong growth in car club members and usage, although happily not a rocketing growth in the number of vehicles. So we're, in general, a lot of it's been banked into greater efficiency of the existing fleet, which is fantastic emissions wise. But you've got to recognize that that palpably, if you look at the live maps on our site, that doesn't cover all of the UK. So then the question becomes, well, what role is there for shared in more difficult to operate areas in the sense of commercial viability? And I think there the broad strokes are it's got to have some support, as we were saying. That's not just about money. I think it's very much policy support, and then it's got to have the goalposts moved a bit on looking at the other options. There's a great question on that. I love the love the frustration. Sounds wrong, but I very much recognise it here in this question, which is could we get serious? It says so. In 2021, a number of county transport authorities are still increasing private car parking standards for new homes, as in raising the number, and certainly I very much recognise that. We're shortly to publish a piece of work on this, actually, and I think we're likely to end up at a figure of around one private car parking space per new dwelling. If you go above that, this is a generalisation, but if you go above that, you're struggling on the sustainable transport front. You want to go as low below that as you possibly can. And 2, expecting electrification to be cover for net zero, which I also certainly recognise. So who wants to come in? Greg?
Well, I wouldn't just point at county transport authorities either. Urban transport authorities are still approving developments in areas which are poor quality. I've seen schemes being approved that have been through previous kind of growth funds that people in private have described to me as clunkers, or things that are basically totally inconsistent with decarbonisation. We're still doing loads and loads of stupid stuff that we shouldn't be doing. Don't think Como UK can stop that or be responsible for that. It can only be a voice for arguing for the sorts of things that we should do and why it should be done. But I mean, if we're really serious about decarbonisation, the first thing you stop doing is stop digging, stop making it harder to decarbonise. We haven't got enough money to do all of the things that we said we're going to do. There is not enough funding to decarbonise on the trajectory that we are required to decarbonise on. So we've got to stop heading in the wrong direction as soon as possible. And all of these things need to be called out. I spend a lot of time now being contacted about this is going on. It's madness. It's like, yeah, it is absolutely ridiculous. So yeah, I don't know, as a community, we've all got that responsibility to call that stuff out.
Yeah, thank you. I think there is a shared responsibility there. And actually, one of my takeaways from COP was to think how Como can be clearer and bolder in 2022 on saying what is needed in the positive sense, and how to go about that and so on. But also, Greg, to your point of what we shouldn't be doing. We do sort of have those conversations behind the scenes, I think, more than in front of them. But maybe it's time we start having them, in front of the scenes more as well. Anybody else want to follow this thread, David?
Yeah, so I think there's a part of it is the discussions, even in shared mobility, are quite siloed, actually. Unfortunately, COVID put an end to this, but we were working with the Greater Paris Authority on integrating car sharing and DDRT. So to bring it together within one app, and then depending on the use, obviously, the person would have either mode available. And that's one of the really rare examples I've seen that happen. So I know there are some exceptions. So Hitrans will turn around and say, well, we're doing a lot of work with DDRT and car sharing, so agree with that. But it's the exception rather than the rule. So I think that's it's to stop these discussions happening in isolation. I haven't really had any discussions in the UK. We've spoken to nearly a large percentage of authorities, and not once has that come up as a topic to look at, for example.
Interesting. Something we can work on a bit together there, I think, and certainly Como can work on. It's Antonia, our fantastic deputy chief exec, always reminds me that when Como changed from being an organisation that had car in the name and was focused on shared car, and they became shared car and shared bike, and then it became Collaborative Mobility UK, so not defined by a mode. Bit of controversy around that at the time, but now we don't find any controversy around that notion at all. But then to your point, David, it's about how to deliver on it, isn't it? Lars, I've got a couple of questions in the chat for you, if I may. So one is, from point location of booking to collecting the car share vehicle, what's the ideal time? Or I guess you could express that in distance, perhaps. I think it's a, a sort of density experience question. Yeah, so if you come back on that, and then I'll fire a couple more in. Thank you.
Okay, yeah. We'll plan the new mobility hubs and car sharing stations with in the urban areas and distance around 300 meters. So if that was understanding the question right, the time can be really quick. You can book the car usually in in an instant when it works well. So it's really accessible to people in the area. Should be.
Yeah, thank you. And again, I think that's really important, isn't it? The convenience factor here. How can we expect people to do something that's not going to be convenient? And then also to you, Lars, Bergen has 7 e-scooter operators, this person hears. Are they replacing car and taxi trips? What's the evidence showing on that?
Wow, that's a $1 million question. Yes. Well, the data so far, we don't have any really solid figures on that yet. We have some surveys that has been done some years ago that indicates that they mostly replace walking trips, like up to 60% walking trips. But the pattern of use indicates that they are used in the rush hours, so that they are used as part of commuting journeys as well. So you could say yeah, probably, and the figures from the operators say that they replace maybe about 8 to 10% of car trips, or 8 to 10% of the trips made by e-scooters are replacing car trips. The figure might be a bit lower than that, but the pattern we use indicates that they are supporting public transport, because the figures for people saying that they're using it, combining it with public transport, is really much higher, about 30-40%, I think. So it's very early to say, because we are doing this as a pilot project with digital regulation, and pulling a lot of data, and it takes a bit of time to analyze it fully. So we'll learn more about that in the next 6 months, I think.
All right, thank you. Certainly here in the UK, we're awaiting, in effect, the government's data publication, which is to be soon, about all the e-scooter trials. We don't really have a very complete picture until that point. There's some encouraging signs, but we don't have the complete picture. So we're all very keen to understand that in depth and see what is going on. I certainly recognise some of those patterns you're talking about. I think it's really important we understand more and more of what these different options do, isn't it? And therefore how they fit in the Swiss Army knife that Claire was reminding us about. David, do you want to come in?
Yeah, so just a few things, because this is what it's all about on one level, in terms of modal shift and taking people out of cars. So I'm known internally as being very how can I put it politely on this call, but really pushing to get data, and it is hard to get data, certainly when it comes to modal shift, and the last thing you want to do is inflate something or make something up. But we're currently in the throes of doing some data research with an authority. I can't say who it is yet, but it's coming out very soon, so you'll know when it comes out. But here were a few things that came out in terms of modal shift from car. It is in France, unfortunately, but we will be looking to deploy the same thing on our UK with our UK authorities. So 35% of people primarily use the car to get about, and now use the DRT service once a week. So that shows a certain level of modal shift. Now, we can't qualify this, and we're going to have to go deeper, but 60% of passengers said their use of car had decreased. And 7%, so this is an interesting one, 7% of people had decreased the number of cars they own as a result of the service. And I think that's really the crux of what we're trying to get to, is stopping people buy the car. So yes, the percentage is small, and it's going to be, because we're at the beginning, but we, nearly, so 7%, we thought that was starting to make an impact, starting to chip away at single car usage or single occupancy car usage.
Thank you. That's really interesting. Looking forward to that piece of work. I think one of the paradoxes we see at Como is that shared cars are actually one of the most effective ways of breaking the link between car ownership and car use. They can't work single-handed, as we've been saying through this session. It is the Swiss Army knife, but we need to, a bit with subsidy, we need to understand the word a bit more sophisticatedly than just cars, because so often people just think of privately owned cars and their dynamics, but actually shared cars and shared transport have a very different set of dynamics. And then you run that through and you end up with some very different numbers. Our number's 18.5 private cars displaced per car club car. Conscious of time, we've got one more poll to fit in a second, but before we get to that, there's a couple of really interesting questions I just want to throw in as we move to a close about rural and trying to draw these threads together, really. I think there's a couple on this line, but one sums it up nicely. It rightly makes the point, an average rural journey to work is much further than an average urban trip to work. There is greater CO2 per rural car, therefore. What about monetizing carbon to make the case for more rural transport funds? Can I throw that out there?
I don't know, Richard, but what we can see is that if people are going to continue driving petrol or diesel cars in those areas, in 5 or 6 years' time, they're going to be paying the majority of the fuel duty in the UK. So actually thinking about how we can accelerate the electrification of areas which don't have alternative mobility systems, I think is something that really needs to be looked at.
Yeah, that's a really excellent point. Anyone else want to come in on that?
I think the difficulty of the topic is shown by the silence, actually. So that's about the most intelligent thing I have to say on
that. Well done, David. Yeah, whoever that questioner was, sorry, I can't see on the feed I've got, but that's right. You can take a sort of thoughtful silence. It's indicating a great question. Let's move towards a close in this fantastic session. Thank you so much to all of you speakers and to all the great questions we've been getting. Could we pop the poll up, please? Hopefully a bit of magic's now happening. Yes, thank you. So poll's now open, free open text. So just pop in what your key takeaway has been from this session, if you would. We shall see what comes through. And then I've got a couple of sort of tiny announcements to make about what to do elsewhere in the conference and next session coming up, etc. All right, I'm hoping the poll is drawing to a close. And in the meantime, let me just flag that there is the rest, so to speak, of a conference to explore. So in this hop-in platform, do have a look around. Loads of you have been saying hi in the chat and making connections there, which is fantastic. There are networking options to look at on that tab. Also, do check out the booths from sponsors and from members. That's in the Expo tab. Have a dive in there. Q&A has been fantastic. Please keep that going in all the future sessions. And then next up, could we move to that slide, please? Thank you very much. Next up in 15 minutes, we have Build It and They Won't Drive. You see what we're aiming for there. This is all about the world of the built environment, spatial planning, and how to build in sustainable transport and not build in private car use. There is then the booths to look at, in particular during the break around lunchtime. Then our mental physical health session on bike share, virtuous cycles at 1, and powered micromobility at that great tipping point that we think it is at 2:45. Thank you so much to my speakers. Thank you to all of you listening and questioning, and see you very soon in the rest of the conference.